Good afternoon, good morning, actually, I suppose. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers and the sponsors for inviting me to come and give this talk. This is my first time in Taiwan, my first trip to HitCon. It's fantastic to be here, and I really appreciate the invite. As he mentioned, I don't speak Chinese, unfortunately, but it sounded like he went through a little bit of my background. I'm Visi, the founder of the Vertex Project, also way back in the day, the father of the APT-1 report, and also way back in the day, in the ancient times, I won DEF CON CTF in 2002, so that's a long time ago. But today I want to go over and talk through kind of the history of some of the APT-1 report and what it took to build it and what our thinking was when we did so, and then what I still believe that implies for the future of our infosec industry, and in particular of the Intel discipline and the analysis that goes on inside of the CTI space. So way back in ancient times, let's take a trip back to 2013. And late one night, sitting around in our lab at Mandiant, we were drinking scotch, like we did in our lab, because that's how things work. And we were basically kind of considering this APT-1 problem, where essentially the amount of data and the sheer impact that they were exfiltrating from American companies and English-speaking organizations was just so vast and so large that we were trying to think, like, what do we do about a problem like this, right? How do you address a problem at this sort of national scale when you're just a person sitting in a lab, right? And so it kind of started off as a joke, actually. Anybody who tells you that the APT-1 report was a Mandiant marketing ploy has never talked to me about it. Because it literally started off as a joke. We were sitting around and we were like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we were to dump their backpack out on the table and dox a threat actor, right? Kind of on a nation-state scale. And we laughed about it and joked about it, and after a little while, we kind of realized that we were serious, right? We knew a lot of details about these people as even individuals, right? This wasn't theoretical attribution. We knew where they dropped their kids off at school, right? And so we realized that the only thing that we could actually think to do about this problem was to dox these organizations or to bring these issues to the forefront. And so we decided to propose to raise the alarm. And so we dubbed it Project Nightmare, which was essentially something that was never published. It was never part of the APT-1 report. But internally, we called the Project Nightmare. And when we proposed it, I first scheduled a meeting with Travis Reese and Kevin Mandia to propose the idea. And we were so secretive at the time about it that we didn't even want to have anything in the title of the meeting. And so I remember literally just making up words for the title of the meeting, and Travis accepted the meeting immediately because he was like, well, if Visi's asking for a meeting of a bunch of random words, it's gonna be interesting. So one of the things that I've never really talked about publicly is a lot of the details of why we specifically chose APT-1. Because at the time, we knew of a lot of threat actors, right? We were tracking a lot of PLA groups, we knew a lot of MUCDs for a lot of the other PLA units and a lot of the MSS actors, and even other countries could have been potentially the target of this report, right? And so we knew about a lot of other organizations, so why APT-1 in particular? And the first and foremost, we wanted to have a large impact, right? This was not your typical spy versus spy stuff. My background is actually in the US intelligence community doing CNO dev and vulnerability research, right? And so the traditional sort of spy versus spy, spying and hacking as a tool of nation statecraft is part of the game. But what we thought was sort of unfair is a nation using those types of resources, using that type of capability to carry out economic espionage, right? To basically cheat at the market versus carry out, your kind of traditional tools of statecraft. And so, economic espionage being carried out by a country, again, targeting primarily English-speaking businesses, exfiltrating terabytes of data a week, all the way from technical schematics of aerospace engines, all the way through to studies of pharmaceutical studies of the effectiveness of newly developed drugs, right? This was a vast effort that was taking just huge amounts of data from multiple disciplines. And so we deemed this as sort of an existential threat, right? When an organization can subsequently take all of this data, produce products or produce capabilities without having to invest in all that research and development, obviously they can come to market with cheaper products and not have to recoup all of that investment. So essentially, we decided that this one was in particular an existential threat. And so one of the things that, that General Keith Alexander, the director of NSA, subsequently mentioned about APT1 in particular, and just sort of the whole China Nexus actors, was that it was the greatest transfer of wealth in human history, right? This was theft. This was intellectual property theft. This wasn't nation crafting, right? So one of the other reasons that we chose APT1 in particular is the data collection. So long before anyone had ever mentioned something called an orb network, which is a more recent term, there were still this hop infrastructure, these relays, these operational relay networks being used to make sure that no victim network saw the originating addresses that were actually the attackers. And so at the time, APT1 in particular would have these very long-lived hosts. They would compromise some box that no one cared about in the US to make sure to relay or bounce all of their connections off of those boxes. And in a lot of instances, those networks, those boxes, they use them for a very long time. And so this is something that's no longer true, right? As I'll mention in a later slide, but essentially these hosts, these compromised systems, they would use them for years, like literally consecutively for multiple years. And so we had a whole team inside of Mandiant that would go and approach some of these organizations that had these compromised systems that were being used as relays, right? It wasn't that they compromised that system because that was a real target. They compromised that system out of convenience to use it to target other organizations. And so in a lot of these instances, we would actually then go to this organization that had this compromised infrastructure, and we would be like, hey, you have a compromised system in your environment. We would like to monitor that system. We will pay to build parallel infrastructure to replace this server for you, right? And we would like to leave this server in place. We will isolate it from the rest of your network, we'll protect you from it, and we will take over monitoring it, and then we will install our own monitoring tools so that we can have continuous access to this C2 infrastructure that's actually being used by the threat actors. Another reason for APT1 in particular was there were some pretty egregious OPSEC errors made early on. And so one of the APT1 threat actors, whose handle was Ugly Gorilla, Wang Dong, was very, very careless early on. And that allowed us to pull some threads from way back in the day. Things like literally having in several malware samples, things like no doubt to hack you written by Ugly Gorilla with the date, right? Can you imagine something like that happening in modern times? It's very unlikely. But back then, there wasn't really much of a concern in attribution because no one had ever published public attribution data, right? No one had ever raised it as an issue. And so he would commonly do things like use his uglygorilla163.com email address to register FQDNs that were used operationally in actual offensive hacking operations, while simultaneously using that same email address to post on China Mill forums and things like that, right? So we thought it was fairly obvious that he didn't really care too much about the threat of being attributed. And so that sort of brazen attitude was also one of the things that we wanted to address, right? When you're involved in nation-state offense, the concern over being caught, the concern over being published is a problem, and you need to make sure that those are the rules of the playing field for everyone, and not having folks out there that are, not having actors out there who don't care about being caught. One of the other things was the volume of activity allowed us to do some pretty high resolution analysis of things like pattern of life. So for the analysts in the room, pattern of life, you're probably familiar with it, but for those of you who aren't, pattern of life is any secondary characteristic that can be used to characterize that person's actual real life, right? And so examples of this include things like the PE compile times, right? They didn't realize that they should stamp those out and zero them out so that they weren't indicating when the builds were happening. And so we could see that these tools were being built most commonly between Monday and Friday. And you can see actually that second graph there shows a sort of double bump of the normal pattern of life of a work day, where you have the morning where you come in and you do some work, and then you go to lunch, and then you do some more work, and then you go home, and you might have an evening where you also do some work, and then an overnight cycle where you typically have sleep, right? And so if you look at this graph, one of the interesting things is where in the world is 4 a.m. GMT, 4 a.m. UTC time, lunchtime, right? And so this is just an overwhelming indicator of the fact that these developers were developing things out of GMT +8, right? Beijing time, and Shanghai. Well, actually, all of China time, as I'm sure you guys are familiar with. One of the other things that we thought about rather heavily and very, very thoroughly actually was the risks, right? Different threat actors will respond or would be likely to respond differently to this type of publication. At the time, no one had ever done it before, so we had no idea really what to expect. And so we weighed several of these risks, like the loss of access or visibility. We were definitely aware of the fact that once we outed this, we would probably lose access to all these boxes that we had painstakingly cultivated. Additionally, we would obviously be disclosing the techniques that we were using for monitoring and the tools and the capabilities of our analysis, and potentially risking retaliation, right? Again, no one had ever done this before. And then the other thing that we were concerned about at the time is even how is the US government going to react? How is the infosec community going to react to something like this? Is everybody going to be mad at us? Is everybody going to love it? Are people going to hate it? And so in a lot of instances, we did actually take these risks and assess the kind of level of risk that they posed to us. And in some instances, we decided that it was worth it, right? The risk of disclosing the techniques that we were using to analyze and monitor this activity was definitely worth it, right? To actually have an impact on this problem. In some of the other instances, things like, the CCP doesn't typically carry out actual force operations in the US, right? So if we were doing this, for example, to someone more like a South American drug cartel, we would have taken that a lot more seriously because the actual risk to our researchers, right? And in modern times, there are a lot of researchers that are publishing currently on threat actors and are receiving death threats and things like that as a result of it. Back then, we weren't really sure how that was going to go, but we decided that because the CCP didn't commonly engage in force projection into the United States, we would probably be okay, right? And again, we decided that the potential intel community backlash was sort of worth the risk. So when I first proposed Project Nightmare, I mentioned that I met with Travis Reese and eventually Kevin Mandiant about the issue. He thought we were crazy. Because for the most part, our background in the intelligence community was like all the data goes in, it's a black hole and nothing comes out. Anyone who's ever worked with government intelligence organizations has seen this a jillion times, right? And so he literally was asking my coworkers, has Visi lost it? Has he gone off the deep end? And after giving it much thought, they were basically like, there's just too many unknowns, there's too much risk. So again, this was absolutely not a marketing campaign. They were originally completely thoroughly against the idea. But subsequently, there were some rumors started that the US government was going to do a big disclosure, which changed the math just a little bit because the risk to that infrastructure and those capabilities, maybe that's all going to get burned down anyway in this big disclosure that the US government is going to do. And it was sort of rumored to be about APT-1, and everybody was like, oh, the US government's going to do this big disclosure, right? And if anybody remembers the actual subsequent disclosure, it was really terrible. It was a list of IP addresses with no additional context, just like, here's a list of bad IP addresses. Super disappointing. But at the time, we didn't know that. And so we basically used that as an argument to go back and be like, hey, listen, this is changing the calculus. And so eventually they said, yes, let's do this. Let's pull the trigger, produce the report, and we'll see what we think. So basically, once they said yes, we decided that we needed to get it done very quickly. And so basically I got asked, how many resources, what do you need to get it done? And I got to kind of pull the Leon the professional and be like, bring me everyone, right? So what we did was we spent basically 2 weeks sleeping under our desks, right? Now imagine this 60-page attribution report. If anybody's read the APT-1 report, it's extremely thorough, exhaustively thorough, right? That was produced from yes, go to the first draft of the report being done in 2 weeks, right? Mostly as a result of us sleeping under our desks and as a result of us having access to structured and programmatically accessible data, which I'll get into in a minute here. But there were whole internal editorial debates. In a couple of instances, I got vetoed, and I did actually embed a couple of things for any analysts in the room. If you write and you have a few certain things that you expect them to want to pull out, then maybe the rest of what you want to get in the report will make it through. And so there were a couple of instances of that. But we also, part of the reason that I compressed the timeline and wanted to get it done so quickly was because I wanted to release it during Lunar New Year. Now, normally when I talk about this, I have to explain to people why that would be interesting or why that would be important. I would imagine I don't have to probably discuss that here. But essentially, obviously the background is everybody goes home, right? Everybody goes back to where they're from. It's a big holiday. Everybody doesn't work, right? And so one of the things that I wanted to be able to do was to watch and see who got called back into work, right? So we did eventually tell the US government, we kind of dropped the hint like, hey, we're gonna do this. We didn't ask permission. And that was because we didn't want them to be able to say no, and also we didn't want them to think that they should have to approve, because then they would be forced to do all this risk assessment themselves. So by asking for forgiveness rather than permission, that made it easier on us and them, actually, right? So once the report actually did finally get published, all the editorial debates were done, watching the reactions was fascinating. We essentially had to create these sort of 5 talking points. I don't know if anybody's familiar with like handling kind of media and publications, but basically you have this technique where like I have 5 answers, and no matter what question you ask me, the answer is one of these 5 answers, no matter how I have to pivot to get back to one of those 5 answers. And so we ended up avoiding the Mandiant offices for months. We had worked out of a space that we called the Lair. I said 2 weeks sleeping at the Lair. And the space that we were working out of at the time was an undisclosed Mandiant location. No one else in Mandiant knew where we were, knew the infrastructure that we had there and knew about it. And so basically we had to spend several months avoiding going into Mandiant offices because there was media and press there that were wanting to interview people and wanting to talk about it, and they were filming the entrance of the building and things like that. And we were still very much in the do not name us, do not publish our names, kind of that whole old school intel background. So the other thing that we did manage to do was track the threat actors reading the report. No one can ever resist reading a report about themselves. And so in a lot of instances, some of the first instances of retrieving the PDF, the actual original PDF document that we published, were actually done by the threat actors carrying out, like they returned and retrieved those documents via their egress, because the Great Firewall of China prevents them from doing it from their actual workstations or from home. And so they have to actually use their operational infrastructure to retrieve that stuff. So one of the results was China's Ministry of National Defense calling us baseless and unprofessional. I loved it, right? Like, so hilarious. We actually debated having like t-shirts printed up so that we could go to conferences like this and say baseless and unprofessional, right? But my absolute favorite media response was a Taiwanese company, NMA TV. Everybody know them? Are they like common still? Like they were back then. So they basically produce these little animated video clips of modern media and modern news. I still have the video clip. I'd be happy to share it with anybody after this who wants to. But it's hilarious. Basically, they had like this video image of Obama sitting in the White House, and a panda jumps out of the report and slaps him across the face and whatever like that. So kudos to the Taiwanese media, because they produced my absolute favorite response to the report. How am I doing on time? Oh, sweet. Okay. So, mission accomplished? Kind of, maybe. Of course, it didn't completely stop the activity. But the media did react as we had hoped, right? We had hoped to make people angry. We had hoped to raise the issue, to kind of raise the alarm. And so certainly there were awareness of the issue. I had friends and relatives. My sister was like, so what's this China hacking stuff, right? So the other thing that was a direct impact was the Xi Jinping and Obama summit to set cyber norms. And like I mentioned before, one of the most important reasons that we targeted APT1 in particular was that unlevel playing field, right? Spy versus spy stuff is always gonna happen, right? Tool of nation building, tool of statecraft. But that economic espionage of a nation state versus private industry should be off limits, right? Like you just shouldn't play that way. And so forcing them attempting to force them to play by the same rules was very important to us. So We did see a dramatic decrease in APT1 activity because they had to dismantle a bunch of infrastructure, even if it just caused them to pause long enough that they had to do all their retooling and build all their tools because we had burned down all the infrastructure and we had burned all the tools, right? So for a while, things calmed down. Obviously, that only lasted a while and things have still, kind of risen back up, but a lot of the other groups also did briefly have an operational pause and where they were forced to retool and forced to kind of be like, okay, is this activity worth it or not, right? And that was really the goal, was to make them do that second guessing, do that deconfliction, and do that sort of playing by the same set of rules. So all of that was many, many years ago now, like, 13 years ago now? So modern challenges to analysis have changed a lot. Attribution has gotten far, far more difficult. Blended espionage and financial motivations have cropped up, right? Threats frequently exhibit even multiple motivations where maybe by night they're hacking for financial purposes and by day they're contracting for nation-state threat actors. Also, false flags and purposeful deception. These threat actors used to kind of not care about getting caught, but the publication and the subsequent onslaught of other companies following suit has caused these organizations to realize that they need to use deception, they need to use false flags, and they need to, point the finger at someone else. The other thing is the specialization of threat groups as they've evolved over time. It used to be that one organization, APT1, the one person might actually be kind of the developer and might be the operator and might be the infrastructure maintainer, kind of all in one. And with the subsequent specialization where you have a team of devs that just do the dev, you have a team of operators that just do the operations, and in a lot of instances you even have like these infrastructure management teams and stuff like that. That type of specialization means that in a lot of instances the attacks themselves are blended from multiple organizations, infrastructure from this one, tools from this one, the operators from this one. And that can really muddy the waters from an attribution perspective. It blurs the boundaries of the sort of traditional monolithic hacker group in the basement. One of the other things that's caused significant troubles in attribution in modern times is the tendency for threat actors to realize that they shouldn't develop custom tools if they don't have to, right? There are a lot of instances where those custom tools were the thing that we could use to attribute them, were the thing that we could use to pivot and correlate that activity had been carried out by the same actor. If they had some super cool custom tool that they didn't publish, that wasn't open source, then if you saw that tool in two places, there was a pretty high likelihood that both of those operations were carried out by that one threat actor. And also, of course, they modernized and realized that they should wipe out PE build, compile times and things like that to avoid the pattern of life analysis. So, and then there's obviously been pretty radical changes in the way that C2 infrastructure works. Long gone are the days of those relay boxes that they lived on for years at a time, right? Now they spin up a box, do one thing, and spin that box down, often via cloud providers and cloud infrastructure, so that those systems are ephemerally in use, very rapidly turn over. And in a lot of instances, they even use legitimate services, right? How many newer malware families or newer C2 infrastructure have we seen actually carry out its communications via GitHub or via Google Documents and things like that, right? Like that never used to happen, and that's much more difficult because they don't have any infrastructure then, right? Sorry, pardon me. Also, in modern CTI and the modern intel analysis discipline, there are lots of organizational issues, right? With common understanding comes things like money and burnout and overwork and layoffs, right? And so in a lot of instances, things like data silos within organizations, there's a natural conflict between the analyst's needs to have access to data and privacy, as an example, right? There's often legislation that mandates those data silos to be in place. Also, CTI providers, I don't know if you guys have seen, but almost every major CTI provider, almost every major intel analysis organization is under constant reorg, right? And I think that this stems in a lot of instances from them not having understood the value of the team and not having set good expectations, right? Which kind of gets into the fourth bullet there about executives who don't understand what Intel teams should be doing. So, when there's an expectations mismatch, and even things like, the failure to demonstrate value, right? I have a motto that I say is the reorgs will continue until the perception of value improves, right? And so in a lot of instances, these orgs are just throwing reorg charts and throwing organizational hierarchies at the wall to see what sticks, to see what works. And that's very stressful for analysts, right? This slide is a personal pet peeve of mine. Vendors and tooling. This slide could be an entire talk. Vendor APIs and data is honestly pretty terrible right now. There are a lot of orgs that are trying to improve and trying to get better, but lack of normalization, lack of providing sufficient context, lack of providing good structure, lack of understanding that just because you take a big blob of text and wrap it in a JSON dictionary, that's not structured data, right? Thwarts analysis, it thwarts automation, and in a lot of instances, it makes it very, very difficult to scale analysis, right? And also, with those, with the money comes the hype, and it gets very difficult to tell the difference between the providers of good, accurate analysis that's well-reasoned, and people, again, kind of throwing things at the wall to see what sticks, publishing early, getting things turned out before they have sufficient evidence. And so there aren't a lot of organizations that will publicly chastise an organization for doing that kind of thing. And so that's a very, very real modern difficulty for analysts because they're faced with this expectation that they can turn out. They've always got something to say. They've always got to have some ability to turn around and, and produce output. So, and then most current tools, they lack the real utility that's necessary for analysis. Analysis is research, right? I actually fairly frequently make the analogy that like actual Intel analysis is actually more akin to offense than it is to defense because it's a very active research process where you sort of fail until you don't, right? And so if research is the art of failing until you don't, then the way to research better is to fail faster. So in a lot of instances, the tools that these analysts are using are disparate. They're not centralizing data, they're not centralizing knowledge, and they're not scalable. So, in any case, another difficulty in the current environment is the explosion of data, right? We've kind of gone from like not having sufficient visibility to having too much visibility, right? Now, there are a lot of organizations that just have these oceans of logs and SIEM and cloud and EDR, right? The volume of threat activity is growing. Asset management, inventory control, how do you know what you're protecting? How do you know what's your responsibility? In a multinational conglomerate that's acquiring a company every month, how can you even track what it's your responsibility to be aware of, right? And then, like I mentioned before, GDPR and legislation is limiting analyst fusion, right? Like in a lot of instances, it's that fusion process and that bringing all of that data together into one system to create a holistic picture of the known universe. And so like mandatory data segmentation or even controls that exist inside of companies that aren't legislatively mandated but are mandatory inside of those organizations for privacy reasons and things like that, which are all very well founded. But there's a very natural friction point between those types of privacy controls and analysts' ability to do their job. And so in my opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of current analysts, right, the analytical methods and tools just currently can't keep up. So with all those challenges in mind, what does the next 10 years hold, right? And I get asked this question quite a bit. And in my opinion, I think that what we need to do, unfortunately, currently, is we need to learn to do more with less. But how do we do that, right? I think that in a lot of instances, we have overly specifically scoped, we have overfit the definition of CTI, right? The concepts of Intel analysis as a discipline, coming from my background in the intelligence community, it's a much broader discipline. And CTI is still overly focused on malware families and FQDNs and DNSA records, right? Whereas in a lot of instances, the problems that businesses are trying to solve are more holistic. So by essentially unifying intelligence functions, right, there are little pockets of intelligence analysis happening all over inside of companies right now. And they're all disparate and they're all fragmented and none of them collaborate very well. So what if we were to think way bigger, right? I believe right now that the CTI discipline and intelligence discipline, I don't like to call it CTI because that actually is part of that overly scoping. But essentially, if we were to think way bigger, right, if we think back 30 years ago, right, I was around back then. 30 years ago, infosec, right, information security was like that one dude in the corner who knew how to write firewall rules. And he worked inside of the IT department, right? There was no infosec department. There was no CISO. That didn't exist. And so I think that CTI and intelligence as a discipline in the private sector is currently in that phase of its life, where it's just sort of a little kind of spur hanging out of infosec. So if we were to take all these fractured roles that are currently spread throughout organizations and unify them, we can maximize the effect of their analytical overlaps. In a lot of instances, these different disciplines and the use cases are talking about the same things, and their assessments would be valuable to each other, but they don't share tooling, they don't share a picture of the universe, they don't have knowledge management systems that are integrated. And so by essentially, by unifying these intelligence operations all inside of one organizational hierarchy, potentially under an eventual chief intelligence officer, which we are seeing that like chief intelligence officer concept being adopted by private companies now. I believe that they will eventually conglomerate together a lot of these little intelligence analysis disciplines that are spread throughout the organizations and essentially eventually give better executive visibility. They'll have independent budgets, right? Right now, in private sector, infosec usually has its own budget. It has its own executive representation, its own mission. So a little bit on how do we get there from here. And this is kind of, one part speculation, one part tough love, and one part recommendations. But one of the things that I think is the most important is to embrace scope creep. As developers, we normally think of scope creep as kind of a negative thing, right? It's, now I have to do all of these other things that I wasn't gonna have to do before. But in the Intel world, scope creep means increased impact, right? And increased impact comes with increased stability, increased budgets, increased visibility to the executive organization. And so there are a lot of disciplines that are adjacent to CTI right now, but I would say are part of the intelligence discipline holistically. Things like information operations are typically covered by CTI, but why? For example, if propaganda was still most efficiently distributed by dropping leaflets like we used to do in World War II, that's how we'd be doing it still. So why is information operations CTI at all? It's intelligence, but it's probably not technically CTI, and yet we group it in there because it makes sense, because the use cases are similar. In some instances, even things like trust and safety and insider threats and HR need to be embraced inside of the CTI scope. So I'll give you a quick example. SentinelOne recently published that they're using their Intel team to now vet inbound applicants to the hiring process, where their actual Intel team is correlating those people's experience and the bullet points that they have and the statements that they have and where the submissions are coming in from and what time of day they're coming in from and when they're able to meet to do assessments about those people potentially being DPRK remote workers, right? Insider threat. That's not actually traditionally CTI, but it is absolutely Intel. It's Intel analysis. And so this is a great example of an early adopter case where they have realized it's this team over here, this CTI team is the team that's equipped to handle this problem despite it being outside of their current scope, right? We also need to take some time and determine our role as analysts inside of the business. And this gets a little bit maybe into the weeds for the CTI and analyst-specific disciplines. But essentially, in a lot of instances, I've seen a breakdown in organizations where the analysts are like, well, they don't ask us for anything, they don't ask us for anything important. And then if you talk to the executives, they're like, well, they don't tell us what we can ask them for. And so in a lot of instances, there's literally just a breakdown in the communication between between the analysts and the executives. So determining our role inside of the business would also allow us to potentially, for example, make friends with the owners of those individual data silos, potentially offering them our analyst feedback, our solutions to some of their problems in order to gain access to their data and fuse it as part of our additional scope, right? Running short on time. Meeting the challenges of scale. I think this mostly speaks for itself. Things like industry standardization, MITRE ATT&CK, STIX taxi are a good start, but they're overfit. Show me where I can represent DPRK remote workers submitting resumes as part of MITRE ATT&CK. Show me how I can represent an organizational hierarchy of front companies in STIX taxi. Right? These are they're overly scoped. They're too specific to the use cases that they were invented for, right? Meaningfully, and that's good. And then one of the other things that I think is a key point, I'll kind of skip over a couple of these things, but engineers and analysts need to get closer to each other because in a lot of instances, I encounter organizations frequently where the engineers assume that they know what the analysts need. And they build tools based off of their assumptions of what the analysts need, rather than actually talking to the analysts about what they need and taking feedback and making sure to produce the things that the analysts want to use and need to use. So many times the coders they end up just basically producing the wrong tools faster, right? Making strong recommendations is super critical. In a lot of instances, analysts get bogged down in I need to just store and report in sort of a journalistic fashion. But as an analyst, your assessment is valuable. The actual thing that you're there to do is tell them what to do. They don't want to know all of the possible recommendations. They want to know what you recommend. And so giving concrete recommendations and feedback is something that's absolutely critical to getting to the point where Intel evolves into its own organizational hierarchy. And then I'm definitely going to run short on time. Adapting the message to our audience. This is pretty clear. If your message as an analyst isn't landing, if you're not being heard and you're not being received, then that's on you, right? If you say, oh, they didn't understand me because they weren't paying attention, they weren't listening, right? And this is actually pretty true of infosec in general. Is in a lot of instances, people are like, well, they were just, they're not understanding, they don't know enough to understand me. Those are instances where what you should do is you should take that as the opportunity to educate the recipient, educate your customer, your internal customer. So I'm definitely running out of time. So the shape of the future is up to us. The message that I want everyone to take with them is the APT1 report wasn't a one-off, right? There are a lot of instances where we as individuals are the ones deciding on the direction of the industry. I'm just standing up here as a person who was drinking scotch in my lab late one night and started a joke that spawned an industry, right? So that being the case, keep in mind that the shape of the future is up to us. Does anybody have any questions? I'm gonna try this out real quick. Xie? Is that close?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we still have time for one or two questions. So anyone have a question?
Hey, hi. Thank you for the very informative sharing. If you talk about the CTI, I would like to ask some question regarding how to optimize the CTI for every local region. Because CTI, the great issue of CTI is regarding whether the intel is localizable and whether it's very accurate. So is there any recommendation that you could give to anyone else in this room how to optimize the CTI and how to localize it? And because you are not involved in those, the incidents, so you don't have any very hands-on information. How can we optimize them with those services? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in a lot of instances, there are organizations that are too prone to attempting to like have to say something about things that they don't have any first-party knowledge of, right? So, my advice would be, get access to your own internal data first by hook or by crook, right? Not having access, not having visibility over your own internal data. There are probably little pockets of just vastly valuable data inside of almost every large organization, right? A lot of the things that I'm talking about, they haven't really trickled down to smaller organizations yet. It'll take years and years before that's the case. But inside of big organizations, you almost always have some data sources that are first-party data. And then, of course, there's the process of automating and ETL pipelining and normalizing and things like that to then, automate enrichments from whatever vendors or whatever third-party APIs you have. But, ask me about Synapse as an aside if you want to, but essentially that's a platform that we've developed at the Vertex Project to facilitate that.
Yeah, so if you have any question, yes, you can just come to front end and directly discuss with VC. And 那我们再次掌声感谢 Visi 的演讲。